Hi, I'm Bob Doyle, webcasting from my ITV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm hoping to reach philosophers and scientists around the world to help solve several problems in philosophy, in psychology, in biology, and in physics. I also hope to reach any of you who are wondering about the deep nature of reality and our place in the universe. We live in the information age, but I find that very few philosophers or scientists understand the nature of information. Information is neither matter nor energy. Information needs matter to be embodied in our brains, for example, and it needs energy to be communicated, like this lecture coming to you over the internet. But matter and energy are conserved quantities. It may be hard to believe, but the total amount of matter and energy in the universe today is the same as there was at the beginning of the universe nearly 14 billion years ago. And if the stuff of the material world is just a fixed total amount, what can possibly explain all the evolutionary change that we see around us? These changes are the information and order in the universe, which have been increasing since the beginning of time, despite the second law of thermodynamics and the increasing entropy, which is said to destroy order. Now, change is simply the arrangement of the atoms and molecules into what I call information structures, like the galaxies, the stars, and the planets. But stars are passive objects under the complete control of physical forces like gravity, nuclear forces, and so forth. But living things, you and I, are dynamic and growing information structures under our own control. I'll show that we are forms through which matter and energy continuously flow. And I'll show its information processing from the DNA in our cells to the thinking in our minds that controls those flows of matter and energy. Information is the modern spirit, the ghost in the machine, the mind in the body. It's our souls, and when we die, it's our information that perishes. Only our matter remains. Information philosophy can explain some mysterious aspects of quantum physics, like the two-slit experiment, the collapse of the wave function, and entanglement, which claims that a cat can be simultaneously dead and alive, and that one object can be in two places at the same time, or that information can travel faster than the speed of light. Working through Albert Einstein's study of the universe and what he called objective reality, I hope to show that such spooky action at a distance is just simply not possible. Okay, today we are going to be looking at let's see, number 3, go here. I'm still learning to use these tools that I've been designing and building, wiring together for some time now in order to produce what I call my ITV studio, my internet television studio, or webcasting studio. I'm able to reach out from this room to YouTube, online streaming video, and Facebook, similarly streaming video, and also to our local cable television channel in Cambridge, CCTV. And it's taken a good deal of time to come up with this design, and I'm not necessarily as good as I hope to be, but I am working with multiple cameras and multiple screens. Sometimes I like to show my way around, so let's take a look from the camera that's up to my left. And it lets you see the control surfaces I have in front of me. Here's a page with Dan Dennett will be coming up in this lecture. Here's the blog, my iFi blog on this screen, and this allows me to switch between the screens. So let me switch back to screen 3 and show you that I have the Surface tablet on my right, and I'm able with that tablet to move around very nicely and let you see that what we're looking at here is my information philosopher blog. The blog turns out to be a very powerful way to organize my lectures. I'm now in the 4th week, and I've been sending people to YouTube to look up my lectures, but YouTube itself is a rather difficult interface. I've already got 16, 17 lectures, and it comes to be difficult to see the different lectures. So here, my blog lets me put up the title of the lecture and a little bit of description of what's going on in it. We'll come back to this one in a moment. I can add a diagram. Let me enlarge this view for you. I can add a reference. Here it says, see chapter 20 of Free Will, The Scandal in Philosophy, and the blog supports a very nice capability. If I click on chapter 20 and then say open in a new tab, I then have a new tab open, and here's the chapter that we're going to be studying today. I'll do that again. And then I'll come back to my blog here. And as I scroll down at the end of today's lecture, here is yesterday's lecture, in which we picked some animations about the two-slit experiment. Yesterday we were working on the problem of wave-particle duality, because Mondays are Great Problems Day. Tuesdays, today is Free Will Day. And what I want to remind you is that I have a book on great problems and I have a book on free will. And this is the one we're going to use today. This is the one we used yesterday. And now it seems like a nice idea to start talking to you about what we're doing by looking into the chapter. In particular, the chapter that I want to explore today is the question of separating the idea of free will, the question of free will, from the problem of moral responsibility. Now, I find that in the last, let's put us back on my little screen here with the lecture for today. Just go quickly ahead. Yesterday's lecture with the video ready to stream right here. I can touch this and yesterday's lecture streams just like that. It's at the moment I'm just waiting for that show to start. Here's the lecture last Friday, and it has the video right embedded here in the screen. It's really very convenient because the blog is a chronological record of all my past lectures. At the point we've got some 16 of them here, each one with its own YouTube video embedded. Here's one on David Laser that we did last Wednesday during our Philosophers and Scientists lecture. Okay, so let's come back to today and take a look again at this book.
I'm Bob Doyle,
And now
the information philosopher.
Started over here, so
Webcasting from my ITV studio in
cause it to pause. And okay, so we're back at this concept that for many years, those who argue against the existence of free will, which has been done off and on by people who have a scientific view of the world, a natural view of the world as somehow governed by forces, by laws, by physical laws, by powers that be. The great question in a theological setting is, does an omniscient God control all things? Some religions think such a God does, and that leaves little or questionable room for any role for ourselves. Going all the way back to Aristotle, he wondered whether there were any things that depend on us, as opposed to just depending on either natural laws or what he called chance. Some things might just happen by chance, and we couldn't be responsible for them. Aristotle famously decided on the grounds of Epicurus and his ideas about swerving atoms, introducing randomness into the universe, that perhaps you could say there are three ways things can happen. They can happen because they're completely determined, some sort of causal chain from the time of the prime mover leading down to the situation we're in today. Or perhaps Epicurus is right. Occasionally the atoms which make up the entire universe in the materialistic view of the universe would introduce a little chance, so that there could be an accident, and that accident would be the reason for what's happening. Or, finally, he suggested there might be a third way. Between chance on the one hand and determinism on the other, there might be a way that something in our minds, something belonging to us, could start a new causal chain. He called them a archai, a new start, a first moment, which would set in motion another chain of events. Those things that he imagined could be up to us could be the source of human freedom, and alternatively or subsequently responsibility, that we are in charge of what is happening in our own lives. Now, through the centuries, this has been debated, and especially after physics became so solidly certain in the Newtonian age, when it seemed as if there were laws of gravity that were governing the motions of everything in the universe. The planets were clockwork, everything seemed to be, without a doubt, predictable and certain, and thus determined by causes which we now could not only understand, but we could write down as a law, that the force is equal to the gravitational constant g times the masses involved, divided by the square of the distance between them. The inverse square law seemed to be the epitome of a picture of understanding the way the whole world works. And surely if the whole world, the whole universe, the whole solar system was following natural laws, who could claim that humans were exempt from such natural laws, that we had miraculous, some called it, or in any case exceptional powers by which we could appear to violate these laws? And that has come down to us today in a very large number of people who teach philosophy. They basically teach the idea that surely if we have any degree of free will or freedom, it must be compatible with these powerful laws. And compatibilism is so called, something in our William James lecture we discussed he called a soft determinism. He argued that those who accepted the laws as governing everything should be called hard determinists. They just see no room for any human freedom and no room for any responsibility on our part, because everything is happening according to these laws. But then he found people were coming along who were saying, well, you know, we don't want to use the hard words like fatalism and that everything is out of our control. And they said, well, maybe we have a degree of freedom as long as we're not in chains somewhere, and that he called soft determinism. Well, today, that's called compatibilism, a sort of catch-all word that students in philosophy are expected to understand that says, look, our freedom is compatible with the universe as a whole being determined. And polls of philosophers today show the majority of them believe that this is the case, that the laws of nature do determine, but in the end of the day, we have a kind of freedom which could be included within compatibilism. Sometimes they say, well, there's a causal chain coming to us from the past, and all events are happening, and as it comes up to the moment when we're about to try to decide and make a willed action, that the previous causes perhaps do cause our choice, cause our thoughts which lead to our action, but all the subsequent causes must include this event in our brain, which, although it was caused, it's made us part of the causal chain by which everything happens, and they somehow feel comfortable with this. They think, I'm in the chain, I'm part of this thing here happening, so why should I look at this from the point of view that everything that's happening is happening to me? I'm in the middle of the chain. Why not? That's enough freedom for me. That's a very, to me, disturbing idea to accept. And that philosophers, so many, teach this idea with the implication that the students who are listening are hearing that they are actually just the product of innumerable causals coming to them from the past. Their genetic inheritance, the environmental conditioning that they've suffered, perhaps by a brutal indoctrination or, ideas pressed on them as if they can't accept anything else or they'll be ostracized from their culture, that everything is traceable to some things happening now to you. This seems like a very bothersome thing to me. I, in fact, call it a scandal. Take a look back at my subtitle of my book, Free Will, The Scandal in Philosophy. I do think of it as a scandal and something that we shouldn't really be teaching our students. So, but what are our options? For one thing, there are a group of philosophers who are compatibilists who want to preserve the notion that even if everything is determined and there's no break in any causal chains anywhere, nevertheless, they argue, we can be morally responsible for our actions. And although this seems like a difficult thing to accept, because either things are determined or they're not determined, as goes my standard argument against free will. If they are determined, then we're not free. So when compatibilists say we are free and morally responsible, they seem to, but that this is all compatible with determinism, they've created a logical, in my view, a scientific error, a mistake. Either there is some openness in the universe, so say the future could be controlled and go in various ways. We are said to be able to go do things otherwise than the ones we do. We're actualists, like Dan Dennett, who was discussed in one of our Philosophers and Scientists Wednesdays. He says that we are only able to do those things that we actually do, so that the future has possibilities, but those are illusions, that the one thing that we do or that the universe does is the only thing that could have happened. Nothing otherwise could have happened. That's meaningless. It's a powerful logical position. It's called actualism. Whatever actually happens is the only thing that could have happened, and in this picture, the future has only one possible future, just as the past had only one possible past. There may seem to have been other possibilities that we could have done, but those are illusions, according to actualists. Okay, so here is the importance of a position like Dan Dennett's, that he wants to preserve moral responsibility. And let me pull this screen down. It's been going up and down because of my showing you the other pages of other days. But what I'm going to try to argue is that, as you know, I want to separate the idea of free and will. And this is to say that the two-stage model wants to say free is a condition in which we consider alternative possibilities. You remember that William James, in the two-stage model today that I trace back to his work, there is a first stage of free will in which we generate alternative possibilities, James called them, mostly perhaps by thinking over the possibilities we've considered in the past, and this time doing one differently from the one we did last time, or maybe two or three or four options that come to us. Maybe one new alternative possibility arrives, which, as James said, it just pops into our head. We have no idea where it comes from. And it could be that sometimes thoughts come into our head that are really crazy, random ideas. Madness, some people call it. I often think that creativity or genius is sort of right up at the edge of madness. And perhaps things do occur to us that have never occurred to anyone else. That's the essence of creativity. So if you are coming up with an idea and you have no idea where the idea came from, perhaps you're just an original contributor of some new way of thinking about the world. And this is a very positive view in my mind that should be imparted to students, that they are free and therefore creative, potentially, and we'd like them to, we always say, experience achieve their potential. If they have only one possible future because of the truth of determinism or under the control of laws of nature, then it's sad to tell them they have no potential. The potential is actual, right? Potential, the word suggests possibilities. And we like to think that our young people have many possibilities with their lives. So it seems to me a scandal, I regard it as unfortunate at best, that the philosophers who discuss free will, and I have the order of 300 books at the moment by many prominent philosophers from the earliest days, for the most part, they want to accept this idea of our lives being compatible with a deterministic view of the world. But I want to separate, as it says here on my screen, separate free will from free from will. So the free part is we come up with ideas, the will part is we use our motives, reasons, feelings, desires to pick among the alternatives, okay? And that's behind us. But now I'd like to say, I'd like to separate free will from moral responsibility. And that's the big headline for our talk today. But in order to do it, I'd like to do it in a couple of steps. First, we're going to separate free from will. And I hope those of you who have been listening to some of my lectures will accept that we've got that behind us. It's something that's in my book, and it's when we're looking into this particular chapter 20, we've come a long way, and we've had a lot of discussion about the two-stage model. I'll try to get into that again. I'm thinking maybe on Free Will Tuesdays, we'll actually start with the earliest thinking on free will, Aristotle, and even earlier, and work our way through the history and come up to today and try to understand how it is that academic philosophy has gotten itself into this, in my view, absurd way of thinking. They've got good motivation, good reasons for this, and I want to give them a chance to express those views. As we move forward with my webcasting, I have built in the capability to have other philosophers come to these lectures and be part of them, either as people in the room with me, seated around the table, or coming in by Skype. So I hope to do those in the future, but I'm still learning how to manage my studio when I'm the only one in the room, which, by the way, there's no technical support whatever here. Most television programs have got people who switch when you have multiple cameras, and I don't have that, so I'm likely to make lots of mistakes. Okay, but we're going to do this by first separating free from will. Let's say that's behind us, but now also want to raise the question of moral responsibility, which is what the determinists are really looking for normally. So I want to, that's sort of step 3 here, the separation of free will from moral responsibility. Now this is interesting. I noticed that there's an underline for linking on separation of free will and moral responsibility from punishment, which is another big issue, both retributive punishment and consequentialist punishment. I hope we have time today to get into those issues, because the idea that we may not be morally responsible has grown into a very large argument surrounding the idea that we're natural things, we're natural beings like animals, and many of us don't think animals should be punished for anything because they are not morally responsible for their actions. When an animal kills a child, often the animal is killed for that reason, but there are those who say, well, the animal was only doing what it was determined to do, and that animals have got this built-in set of rules that they've inherited, and there's no freedom of the kind we'd like to think humans have. Now, not subscribing to the view actually that animals are completely determined, although surely mostly determined, because many of them show signs of making decisions from time to time, which are different from time to time, and that's another whole subject to open up. But this idea of punishment is going to be an issue provided we say that people are morally responsible. So how is it that we can argue that people are morally responsible for their actions if they have no free will and there's no alternative possibilities or real choices in what they do? Notice then I'm going to come here and click on the separation of free will from moral responsibility and see if this gives me a link. It does. It says open the link in a new tab. And let's see if it goes there. And here it opens a chapter, the one that we're in, so it didn't really go to the exact place I wanted it to go. Let's come back here. There's one philosopher who was the subject of an earlier lecture on philosophers and scientists, and that's Dan Dennett of Tufts University, who is a very major proponent of the idea of that we are determined. He is a compatibilist, a confirmed compatibilist. On the other hand, he thinks that determinism does not prohibit us from being morally responsible. So there's a large part of my book here in which I show that in modern times, people who've looked at the problem of free will from the standpoint of a neuroscientist or looking at it from a very naturalist point of view, a scientific point of view, as opposed to a kind of humanist point of view, they have, many of them said, well, if we are determined, there's no freedom for us that's compatible with that determinism. These are the original hard determinists of William James. They say, we're obviously not morally responsible if we're determined. That's the first half of my two-stage model of free will. If the world is determined and we are completely determined, then we're not free. Then one steps right on to say, well, if we're not free, we're not morally responsible. If we're not morally responsible, they step on and say, we shouldn't be punishing anybody. But then there's a subtle argument here that maybe we punish people if it has good consequences. That's called consequentialism. And that's to be distinguished from punishing people to get revenge, which is called retributive justice. We just hit them back because they hit us, an eye for an eye, and so forth. There are those then subtle distinctions between those who do not want to punish people just to get even, because two wrongs don't make a right kind of position. But there are those who can be convinced, well, if we punish this one person, it will have consequences, which leads to others saying, I better not go there. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to be lose my eye because I cost an eye, and so forth. So that gets a little bit dicey, really, because if we start saying that people can only be punished if things are consequential and improve the society, that can lead down a so-called slippery slope to the notion that, well, if overall we have no responsibility, overall there is no kind of justice, overall there is nothing that we normally think about as free people making free decisions and responsible. If we're just behaving in a way that's controlled by the behavioral psychologist's view that we're all just products of being conditioned, why don't we just go out and find some random person and punish them as an example for others to behave? So this is the kind of social engineering that some associate with social Darwinism, and it's a kind of horrible view that our punishing or harming some individuals in order to improve the overall society by setting an example of what would happen. This is a very difficult moral road to go down. But we don't even get there unless we can step back and argue that there is something like moral responsibility, even in a world that's completely deterministic. So let me look to the proponent of this view, who's articulated it best, and that's Dan Dennett of Tufts. Now, while he himself is a confirmed compatibilist, let me bring him to the full screen here for a moment, even a determinist, Dan wrote an article in 1978 in his book called Brainstorms, which actually gave a really wonderful argument for why we should think about what I call the two-stage model of free will. And he writes it up better than any libertarian. So let me just say in passing that he offers a model of decision-making, which involves alternative possibilities. And he gives 6 excellent reasons why this is the kind of free will that libertarians say they want. Now, Dan is also famous for the kind of free will that's worth wanting. And that does not include libertarian free will in the sense of random events creating alternative possibilities. But Dan says that the first thing is that the intelligent selection, rejection, and weighing of the considerations that do occur to the subject is a matter of intelligence, and that's important. He also says, by managing it as a couple of stages, that he thinks it installs indeterminism in the right place for the libertarian, if there is a right place. He basically then makes the case and offers it to philosophers of his day. The title's called Giving Libertarians What They Say They Want. Sadly, most libertarians didn't take up Dennett's offer as something worth considering. And although when I read it in 1978, I had been working on this problem, or a few years after, I'd been working on this problem and thinking that quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle and the indeterminism did mean something important, because if there was quantum noise in the brain, just as there is quantum noise and chance in evolution when we create new species by accident, and then some of those changes do survive. Nevertheless, I thought Dan had it right, and maybe I didn't have to do much more work on this problem because Dan had set people thinking, and I assumed some libertarian thinkers might come along and take up his idea and work with it. Unfortunately, they never did. My wife Holly keeps saying how lucky I am. It's now 30, 40 years later, and here I am still capable or lucky enough to be in a position where this argument for the two-stage model of free will, which I trace back to James back in the 1880s, is still there to be defended. And that's the purpose of my writing this book, which I basically got out about 5 or 6 years ago, and subject of these Tuesday lectures. So back to Dan. Dan thinks that, let me expand this a little more if I can, maybe I can't. Dan argues that many people think free will is an illusion. In other words, if there is no freedom of the type we describe coming from an ability to generate new possibilities, then maybe free will is an illusion. Now, Dan very cleverly says, no, he has another version of free will that's worth wanting, and it's going to be moral responsibility, or what he calls moral competence, that some of us are moral agents, and we can recognize the moral agents from the immoral agents. This gets me into a concern that many compatibilists have argued for years, since Immanuel Kant and other thinkers, that perhaps the only free acts are those that are moral acts. And this is a subtle point, but the idea is that it goes all the way back to virtue is knowledge of Aristotle, this idea that to be virtuous is to know what is the right thing to do. To be virtuous is to have knowledge about the right thing to do. And so you can argue that when someone is doing the wrong thing, when they're being evil, perhaps it's just because they lack the knowledge. Because if they had the knowledge, they would obviously always do the good thing. Well, this is sort of wishful thinking as far as I can tell. It would be great if people who are well educated always did the right thing, but our society is full of people who patently do the wrong thing. We have psychopathic people. We have people who seem determined to go out and do the wrong thing as far as our standards are concerned, which, by the way, opens up the fact that morals are a cultural and somewhat relative, unfortunately. We hope for some things that are absolute. We try to lock them down, sometimes with just a belief as opposed to knowledge, because, as David Hume said, what we ought to do can't be found from looking at the way the world is. We have to look at the way the world ought to be, and deriving ought from is a very tricky subject, something that I will hope to make some small contribution to. But here we are with Dan Dennett, and we can listen to him for a couple minutes here on free will and whether it's an illusion. Let's see if I can open this and have it just pop open. Here we are. I need to put on the subtitles.
Free will.
And I need to turn up the sound.
This one, unlike the others, is quite a popular view these days. There's a whole wave of scientists in the last few years that have been running around saying that free will is an illusion. That's an interesting claim. And the wonderful American comic strip sums up the position perfectly, and that's Dilbert. Here I'm going to enlarge the panels. Do you think the chemistry of the brain controls what people do? Of course. Then how can we blame people for their actions? Because people have free will to do as they choose.
It's wonderful, isn't it?
Are you saying that free will is not part of the brain? Of course it is. But it's the part of the brain that's out there just being kind of free. Are you saying the free will part of the brain is exempt from the laws and natural laws of physics? Obviously, otherwise we couldn't blame people for anything they do.
Connection with responsibility.
Do you think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just float nearby? Shut up.
So
that's it. That is the free will problem in contemporary thinking. And Dilbert's final comment is, if only other people would take him to heart. But in fact, they won't shut up. Here are a few examples. I could have doubled this. Here's Wolfsinger, a very eminent German neuroscientist. No one is responsible for their actions since all is predetermined by the brain. Here's Chris Frith, a Brit. Is it possible to predict people's actions on the basis of neural activity that precedes their conscious decisions? If so, then free will is an illusion. Here's Stephen Hawking. So it seems that we are no more than biological machines and that free will is just an illusion.
So let's stop here and take us back to another quote from Dan that moves on to the argument. Let's see if I'm able to get myself back there. Here he is. That moves on to his arguments that's now going to bring back a free will, but it's not going to be indeterminate. It's going to be something that enables us to be morally responsible, because for Dan, it is moral responsibility. Here's a little clip on his idea that there's a free will worth wanting.
Compatibilists like me, we get rid of the first, preserving the second. As I said many years ago, the kind of free will worth wanting, the kind that secures meaningful life and moral responsibility, is completely compatible with determinism. That's one way you can go. Then the libertarians try to have both, and they end up embracing magic. The new breed of scientists that I'm mainly addressing here claim that free will is an illusion because determinism, or close enough, is the truth. But they go on to say that this has implications for responsibility. Roughly, that nobody is ever morally responsible.
So Dan is telling us, and this is quite correct, that the belief that science was giving us a better insight into what goes on in our brains. These are the same, or some of the same scientists, well, they're neuroscientists today, but they used to be cognitive scientists, they used to be behavioral psychologists who argued that the mind is just an illusion, just like free will is an illusion, and that there's just a mechanical brain organized according to laws of nature, and therefore these ideas, even famously, consciousness is an illusion, something that Dan very cleverly shows the kind of consciousness, the kind of free will, the kind of agency that people want when they look to quantum mechanical events in physics bringing up new possibilities. That kind, he says, is not worth wanting, and it doesn't exist. That requires miracles, he says. Very strange for one of the world's most prominent atheists to get into the subject of whether things are miraculous. But in any case, let's go back to Dan and see him describe the kind of will worth wanting, which for him is to be morally competent. Once again, now I need to learn to turn him on and then turn on the closed captions.
Morality and so forth.
And then bring
well,
him to
that's
full
one way
screen.
you can go. What about working in the other direction? What about starting with the claim that free will is moral competence, and then asking what this implies or presupposes about whether neuroscience has anything surprising to say about moral competence? So that's what I'm going to be doing. And the three themes: predictability, agency, and responsibility. I'm going to start with predictability, and in particular with the game rock, paper, scissors. Everybody here know how to play rock, paper, scissors? Okay.
Okay. Dan goes off into a game where we try to see whether we can predict what the other person is going to do, and that's just a little too technical for us today. We have about 20 minutes left in our program. We just want to see that the strong opinion of Dan Dennett is that a moral competent agent is morally responsible for his or her actions, and this can be the case even if the universe is completely determined. Now, Dan very kindly invited me to attend for a semester at Tufts a graduate seminar dedicated completely to the problem of free will versus determinism. And so it was a very entertaining 13 weeks of back and forth with Dan and with the class, me as the representative of the importance of some sort of indeterminism starting new causal chains, him always arguing that has nothing to do with the problem because what he's interested in is whether or not we have moral responsibility. Now, Dan does a wonderful job arguing against those who say that the lack of freedom eliminates the importance of, or therefore the existence of, a kind of moral responsibility, including an element of punishment. In the class, Dan also invited a prominent naturalist named Tom Clark, who was there to represent the position that if determinism is true, if human beings and all animals are just following laws of nature, the idea that they have a responsibility for those actions, which he thinks they do, but which implies we should punish them. And as we saw, I'm trying to separate the question of responsibility from the question of punishment. Tom Clark's position is we should never punish anyone, because the whole scheme of punishing is just an invention to be used to kind of change future behaviors. That's the consequentialist view. Or we're punishing people to get even. We're punishing people because we're angry, we just feel terrible about the crime that they've committed, and we should just get revenge. As Bob Kane puts this issue up, he says in the courtroom, here's this horrible killer, but as the testimony is presented and the defense attorney brings out the fact of this young person's life has been horrible, they've been abused, never had a chance, they didn't get to be educated for some reason and so forth, and that these things have led to the development of a personality who has committed a crime. But Bob Kane and others, Tom Clark here, is wanting to say that as a society, we should be taking the responsibility for having created this person who is not responsible for actions. I think Tom will then consider the so-called consequentialist argument that nevertheless perhaps they should be punished, just as we remove animals that have done something to harm human beings and so forth. At any rate, the class with Dan did make the case that even if everything is determined, there can be recognized morally competent, he calls them, moral agents who belong to his, quote, moral agents club from those who are not. And he's extremely entertaining in making this case, but he's in a very unusual tight position between those who want freedom on the one hand and those who want this absolute determinism on the other, eliminating moral responsibility. So Dan Dennett is in the middle, saying he can retain moral responsibility. And what he does is a kind of trick to me in philosophical debate. He simply redefines free will as equal to moral responsibility. And let's see if I have got a bit on that argument. Let me just try this little section where I think he's going to say free will just simply is moral competence. And I find this is not a good way to philosophize. It's the sort of thing that really gets philosophy a bad reputation, as if the concepts and the words we choose for those concepts are going to set up the situation so that just the logically thinking about the concepts is going to lead to better understanding, when the underlying question is a question about biology, about neuroscience, about the behavior of organisms, and whether or not those organisms are charting a path that is only one possible future, that all of evolution is predetermined, predestined, when you think of this in terms of an omniscient agent. That's an area I think we cannot go, because we know a good deal more about the fact that the things that happen have a great degree of potentiality to be otherwise, and we can work for a better world than for a worse world, although some of us want to work for something worse because we have, all of us, this freedom, which Dan would like to deny and claim, though, that even though we don't have this miraculous libertarian free will that somehow involves quantum indeterminism, nevertheless we recognize moral responsibility when we see it, which is an interesting argument. But let's hear just a couple of words from Dan making his case.
And morality and so forth. Well, that's one way you can go. What about working in the other direction? What about starting with the claim that free will is moral competence, and then asking what this implies or presupposes about whether neuroscience has anything surprising to say about moral competence? So that's what I'm going to be doing. And the three themes: predictability, agency, and responsibility. I'm going to start with predictability, and in particular with the game rock, paper, scissors. Everybody here know how to play rock, paper, scissors?
Okay, so that's a restatement of what we just heard, that moral competence is equal to free will. It's surprising how many people have been saying that, and I want to turn to a page in my book here. We'll go back one chapter. Take a look down here. There's a famous philosopher named Peter Strawson who in 1962 published a really influential piece on free will and determinism called Freedom and Resentment. And he argued that whatever the deep metaphysical truth on the issues of determinism and free will, people would not give up talking about and feeling moral responsibility, praise and blame, guilt and pride, crime and punishment, gratitude, resentment, and forgiveness. Now, this is a very important insight, and I've traced this back to the work of David Hume, who was greatly interested in the question of what he called moral sentiments. And moral sentiments were the subject of many philosophers in the day of David Hume, notably Adam Smith, who wrote a good deal about moral sentiments and feelings, and of course the great works on economics, which involved people wanting to do things, and allowing them to do the things they wanted to do would create a world in which the combined efforts of many people following their desires and doing the things they wanted to do to better their own situation would create this invisible hand, it's called, that society would then improve if people are allowed to freely do what they will do, want to do, with some observance of a kind of rules. The society has rules, but that the freedom should be maximized rather than minimized. Minimize the rules, the regulations, the constraints, the limitations on people's ability to go out and do whatever they want to do, for Adam Smith. And David Hume had set up these discussions of how it is that people actually make their decisions. And he argued quite controversially for a philosopher that our decisions were not made primarily for reasons. That is to say, it was not a matter of logically working our way through to the thing we want to do. And he argued that more important than reasons to get us to act and accomplish something, we must consider the passions. We must consider our feelings, our desires. So this was the beginning of a rather powerful insight, which Hume's case made, that thinking, reasoning, working through ideas at the intellectual level is not the kind of thing that leads to action in the world, that an action person, an agent, really goes out and does something based on what they want, on their desires and so forth, which, of course, came to be called our sentiments and our feelings, and the importance of moral sentiments in our world. And to think otherwise was to live in an ivory tower where we just reason to the best possible decision all the time, and we always do the thing that reason and logic tells us is the best of all possible worlds, and so forth. So coming back to Peter Strawson, he argued that these things he called reactive attitudes, which I find to line up well with what David Hume called moral sentiments, were more real than whether they could be explained by fruitless disputes about free will, compatibilism, and determinism. These attitudes, these sentiments, these feelings were natural facts of our human commitment to ordinary interpersonal attitudes. Strawson said it was, quote, a pity that talk of the moral sentiments has fallen out of favor, clearly a reference back to David Hume's great work, since such talk was the only possibility of reconciliation between these disputants to each other and to the facts. Now, Strawson was himself optimistic that compatibilism could reconcile determinism with moral obligation and responsibility. He indeed seemed to accept the facts of determinism, although that's some question how strongly he believed in this compatibilism. He felt that determinism was true, but he was concerned to salvage the reality of our attitudes even for libertarians, whom he described as pessimists about determinism. So I find Strawson, as I say, basically changed the subject. let's see if I can put something different up on our screen behind us, or maybe I'll just zoom in to talk to you directly. As our time runs out here, Peter Strawson then led to dozens more philosophers who called themselves compatibilists and who argued that moral responsibility was a real thing that existed, and it was because we have these feelings and moral sentiments, and that we could never get them to go away by any argument that the scientists were giving us that free will is an illusion. Even if Strawson felt the pressure of science telling us that perhaps we are only being controlled by things like our biology and our education and our genetic inheritance and so forth, that Strawson thinks that would never convince anybody that people are not morally responsible and should be held morally responsible. And so I would say even Dennett, who knew of Strawson's work, was part of this current of trying to set up a situation in which we would retain our belief in being morally responsible agents, even if determinism is true and that it's an illusion, that we have any degree of freedom in making our judgments, because we would just look to ourselves and others and say, are they being moral agents? And that's where Dan Dennett comes out. Now, I have this somewhat radical view that we must separate this question of whether we have human freedom, whether there is free will, whether we are creative agents or not, separate that from the question of whether we're morally responsible or not. Because to me, the question of freedom is a scientific question. Either everything that happens to us and every thought we have is there already somehow in the universe, just evolving along and doing the one possible thing that can be done and going to the one possible future, or we have a degree of creativity, a degree of freedom, which needs to be explained ultimately in neuroscience, but I find it deep down in the nature of the physical world in which we are, of course, a part. But I do accept Dan's position that moral responsibility is, in a sense, consistent with being determined. So by arguing that we do act on behalf of our feelings and so forth, that Peter Strawson had argued, and that we should encourage people to think they are morally responsible. That leads them to think we should call ourselves free because it has a beneficial aspect, and there are some hard determinists who say we should stop talking to people about not being free. It leads people to being less responsible and blaming the deterministic universe on these forces that control them. So here we are. I want to separate these two, and I also want to establish the existence of a degree of freedom in our lives so that I can have the best of both worlds, have both a libertarian free will and a morally responsible image of ourselves, that we have not only the ability to be free, to be creative, but we have, therefore, the ability to be morally responsible within our society. But to me, where freedom and free will is a question for science, biology, neuroscience, moral responsibility is a cultural question. It has to be decided by our society. And we decide it together and differently from society to society. And this has enormous implications. How much are these moral senses that we've evolved to be the case in our societies? To what extent are they given absolutes, or are they somehow relative to the society and to the time in which we live? We all know that our behaviors and what's acceptable behavior has changed over time. In our very recent past, our behaviors that are acceptable have changed quite dramatically, in my view. And that's because we are morally responsible only in the context of our society. So thank you very much for joining me today, and let me put up my email again in case you want to contact me. I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to you being with us tomorrow when we go on to our philosophers and scientists and take up Richard Feynman, the great quantum physicist, and return a little to this deep question of quantum reality. Thank you.